Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the Melian Dialogue from Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. Now, like Pericles' funeral oration, which I've done a video about before, Thucydides is not here recording or transcribing exactly what was said in the Melian Dialogue. He's approximating. But the reason that the Melian Dialogue is a particularly important section of the history is because it's one of the first real recorded examples of what we would now call Realpolitik, or real politics, realist politics, sometimes called just power politics. But Realpolitik essentially is the idea that those who are strong enough can do what they want. And this is really kind of at the heart of the Melian Dialogue. So, for a little bit of context, the Melians in the island of Melos were a Spartan colony in the Peloponnesian War, obviously pitted Athens against Sparta. Because Melos was an island, Athens kind of felt that they were entitled to take control of it because Athens was the big naval power, Sparta was the big land power. And so even though Melos was a Spartan colony, because they were an island, the Athenians felt that they needed to have control of the city-state. The other component of it was that Melos had remained neutral in the Peloponnesian War thus far, and so the Athenians were somewhat reluctant to allow their neutrality to continue, partially because either them remaining outside the Athenian sphere of influence or them remaining neutral could be seen by other power, other city-states, other islanders, as evidence that the Athenians, the reach of the Athenians was limited. So the Athenians came to, or sent advisors, diplomats to Melos to talk to the Melians and try and convince them basically to surrender their city to the Athenians. And in this dialogue, the Athenians essentially say, we're not concerned here with the question of justice, and we're not going to be persuaded by any arguments you could make that it wouldn't be just for us to exert power over your city-state. So that's actually one of the really interesting things here, because the Melians have to try and navigate around that in their responses to the Athenians. But I want to read you some of the sections from the Athenian part, especially of this dialogue, so you get a sense of how they approached this Realpolitik approach. So, partway through, the Athenians say, then we on our side will use no fine phrases, saying, for example, that we have a right to our empire because we defeated the Persians, or that we have come against you now because of the injuries you have done us. A great mass of words that nobody would believe. And we ask you on your side not to imagine that you will influence us by saying that you, though a colony of Sparta, have not joined Sparta in the war, or that you've never done us any harm. Instead, we recommend that you should try to get what is possible for you to get, taking into consideration what we both really do think. Since you know as well as we do that, when these matters are discussed by practical people, the standard of justice depends on the equality of power to compel, and that in fact the strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. Now that last phrase is one of the most famous phrases of the entire history, and it's kind of the defining ethos of Realpolitik. The strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. Essentially, the Athenian line here is, we are strong enough to take your city-state by force. We will do that if we have to, and so for that reason you should surrender to us. I'll come back to the Melian response to that point in just a second, but I want to shift down a little bit because the Melians ask basically why the Athenians would even posit that it's better for them to agree to become the subjects of Athens than it is for them to fight and try and remain free. And the Athenians say, we do not want any trouble. We do not want any trouble in bringing you into our empire, and we want you to be spared for the good both of yourselves and of ourselves. The Melians ask, and how could it be just as good for us to be the slaves as for you to be the masters? The Athenians say, you, by giving in, would save yourselves from disaster. We, by not destroying you, would be able to profit from you. And the Melians ask, so you would not agree to our being neutral, friends instead of enemies, but allies to neither side? And the Athenians say, no, because it is not so much your hostility that injures us. It is rather the case that, if we were on friendly terms with you, our subjects would regard that as a sign of weakness in us, whereas your hatred is evidence of our power. So this is, again, one of the really interesting components of this approach to Realpolitik, is that it won't tolerate neutrality. The Melians cannot simply stay out of the war, because if they stay out of the war, then the Athenians posit that other people, other islanders, other neutral city-states will say, we should also be able to stay out of the war. And, I mean, there's that great sort of anti-war saying, what if they held a war and nobody came? This is essentially Athens' fear. What if we are fighting this Peloponnesian War and all of our allied city-states sort of say, we think we'd rather not do that? So Athens sees themselves as Athens sees their position as, we must control the islands because we must control the sea, and we must have everyone on our side or under our control, because that will show everyone who is wavering. And it's also worth noting that by the time of the Melian Dialogue, there had been a number of revolts in various city-states, Athenian allies, Athenian colonies, and things like that, as well as revolts in Spartan colonies and among Spartan allies, etc., etc. So this idea that neutrality is unacceptable because allowing neutrality is a sign of weakness is a very, very interesting point. And again, it's central to this idea of Realpolitik, which is all about establishing as much power and authority as one can. And this is part of the reason that the Athenians give to justify their empire. They actually appeal to natural laws or human nature. They say, because the Melians basically say, the gods will be on our side if you attack us unjustly. And the Athenians say, so far as the favor of the gods is concerned, we think we have as much right to that as you have. Our aims and our actions are perfectly consistent with the beliefs men hold about the gods and with the principles which govern our own conduct. Our opinion of the gods and our knowledge of men leads us to conclude that it is a general and necessary law of nature to rule whatever one can. This is not a law that we made ourselves, nor were we the first to act upon it when it was made. We found it already in existence, and we shall leave it to exist forever after among those who come after us. We are merely acting in accordance with it, and we know that you or anybody else with the same power as ours would be acting in precisely the same way. Now this, of course, is a very traditional justification for imperialism, not just among the Athenians, but among the Romans, among probably the Mongols, among the Islamic conquest of the Middle East, among the British Empire, etc., etc. I mean, empires across history have made this kind of claim that imperialism is natural, everyone with power seeks to build an empire, and it's therefore not ethically problematic to do so. This is also really kind of an ironic stance for Athens to take, because Athens presented itself as this sort of bastion of democracy. And today we often think of democracy and national self-rule as going hand in hand, although those two ideals very frequently don't line up. But we tend to think of democracies as less likely to colonize other nations because democracies are committed to the belief in consent of the governed and rule by the people. Again, there's a huge gap here between what in theory should be the case and what occurs in reality. But this idea that the Athenians, who are championing democracy in their own city-state and among their allies against the monarchical, autocratic kind of rule in Sparta, the idea that they are saying to other people, we have the right to conquer you because we're strong enough to do it, is very, very inconsistent with democratic ideals, I think. They clearly didn't think so, but difference of perspective, I suppose. But I want to come back to the response that the Melians make when the Athenians say that famous line, the strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. Because the Melians make an interesting claim here, because it's an ethical claim against the power politics claim of the Athenians. So the Melians say, then in our view, since you force us to leave justice out of account and to confine ourselves to self-interest, in our view, it is at any rate useful that you should not destroy a principle that is to the general good of all men. Namely, that in the case of all who fall into danger, there should be no such a thing as fair play and just dealing, and that such people should be allowed to use and to profit by arguments that fall short of a mathematical accuracy. So essentially what they argue here is that even apart from the question of whether or not your conquest or extortion of our city-state is just, it is in your best interest to deal fairly with us as a general principle of humankind. This is almost a Kantian argument in a way, because Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, one of his big ideas is the categorical imperative. And one way of understanding that is there should be a law that is true in all cases. It should be a law that's held across the board. And so the idea that people should be treated fairly, or a people should be treated fairly in the case of the city-state of Milos, this is essentially the argument that they present here. It's in the Athenians' best interest to apply this universal principle in dealing with the Melians, because this principle might in future benefit Athens. So the Melian Dialogue, again, is really, really interesting because of the way that it explores it doesn't just sort of glorify the Athenian use of Realpolitik. In the way that the Melians respond in these often very clever and effective ways, this is a dialogue that really challenges the ethos and the logic of Realpolitik in a very, very effective and interesting way.